Okay, Chapter 10, the Presidency. The President of the United States, more than any other official, is the face of the government. He is the person everyone looks to whenever there's a crisis, whenever there is a need for information. He is the focal point of the United States. And so that's what we're looking at in this chapter. We're going to talk about the roles of the president. We'll talk about the powers of the president, and then we'll talk about the executive branch as a whole, because the president is the head of the executive branch, but he's not the only member of the executive branch. So we'll be looking at the executive branch as well. So roles of the president, powers of the president, and then the executive branch. Okay, so let's start off with the requirements and choosing of the president. And very similar to what we saw the requirements to be a member of Congress, the constitutional requirements to become president are relatively few. You must be a natural born citizen, you must be 35 years of age, and you must have lived in the United States for at least the past 14 years. So a couple of things I wanted to mention on these requirements. You must be a natural born citizen. That is, you must be a citizen by birth. You must be born into your citizenship. You can't be naturalized. You can't have been a citizen of another country and then go through the process set out by Congress to become a U.S. citizen and then become the president. You must be a natural born citizen. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have been born in the United States. For example, if your parents are members of the military and they are serving overseas, and you are, let's say, born on a military base in Germany, you would still be considered a United States citizen. So it doesn't necessarily mean someone that was born in the United States. It just means someone that can claim U.S. citizenship by birthright. So those are the legal requirements, but in reality, there are many informal requirements, right? Every American president so far has been a male. Most of them have been white males. Most of them have been members of the Protestant Christian faith. Most have been independently wealthy. Most have come from some sort of background in politics or the military. Very few presidents, there are a couple notable examples, very few presidents come into the presidency as their first job in public service. So those are some of the informal requirements. They're not laid down in law, but that's what most of them have been so far. Now, throughout American history, there have been three distinct periods where the choosing of the president has changed. This has been an ever-evolving process. And even within these three broad periods, there have been changes and differences through the years. So we have the early founding of the Constitution, the early days of the presidency. We have the age of national party conventions, and then the age of primary elections. And we've already touched on some of this, but now we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So for example, in the early days of the Constitution, we see that the presidency was dictated almost entirely by the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College is still used today, but today the Electoral College is at least influenced by the popular vote. They're not the same thing. And as we saw with the election of President Trump, as we saw with the election of George W. Bush, you don't necessarily have to win the popular vote in order to win the Electoral College. However, in the earliest days of presidential elections, many states did not even have popular votes. Their state legislatures chose electors, and those electors voted for the president. We also see caucuses. Caucuses, as we've mentioned before, are meetings by party leaders. And so the leaders of the Democratic Party, or whatever party happened to be in power at that time, the leaders of the Democratic Party would gather together and say, this is who we want to put forth for president. And then the leaders of the Republican Party would do the same thing. They would get together and put forth who they wanted to run for president. The point I'm trying to make is, is that everyday voters might have had no part at all in this process. Again, especially in the early days of the Republic, like for example, the elections of George Washington, many states did not hold popular votes, and so everyday voters took no part in this process. Presidents were chosen by caucuses and by the Electoral College. Now, that's going to change after the election of 1824. The election of 1824 is known as the corrupt bargain, and you can see the results here on this map. If you look at the electoral vote total, you will see 261 total votes were cast. Andrew Jackson received 38% of the electoral vote with 99. John Quincy Adams received 32% of the electoral vote with 84 votes. And then you see Crawford and Clay there as well. And then you see the popular vote. Jackson also took first place in the popular vote with 43%, and John Quincy Adams came in a distant second with 31%. Now here's the problem for Andrew Jackson. In order to become president, you have to win a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. That's 50% plus 1. And if you look at his electoral vote total, he did not. He won 38% of the Electoral College vote. So Jackson did not win the presidency outright. In order to be elected president, you must have a majority of the Electoral College votes. He did not. So the Constitution says if no one wins a majority, it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives will choose who becomes president. Now, the problem for Jackson is that Henry Clay, who you can see came in fourth place, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House. And Henry Clay did not like Andrew Jackson. So Henry Clay uses his influence in the House of Representatives to get his buddy John Quincy Adams elected president. And then John Quincy Adams, once he becomes president, he nominates Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State, which was the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. And so Andrew Jackson immediately cries foul and says this was a corrupt bargain. They sealed this deal behind the scenes and it's not right. Now, it wasn't illegal. It was all completely above board. It was all completely by the books. But it does look kind of shady that the person who got the most votes didn't win the presidency. Another guy got the presidency. So Andrew Jackson will become president in 1828, and he will set out to change this system. So after Jackson, we will see that national party conventions become the norm. That is, big meetings of political parties. Each state gets to send representatives, and then they all get together and decide who's going to run for the presidency. Now, national party conventions are still used today. They're not nearly as important as they were back in Jackson's time. In Jackson's time, they actually chose the presidential candidates. Today, they're mainly pep rallies, and I think we've mentioned this before. They're mainly pep rallies. Who is going to be the candidate is already predetermined through primary elections. That's what we use today, in which everyday voters can vote to choose the candidate. So you will see through the years, as the process has evolved, more and more everyday voters have been able to take part in the process of not just choosing the president, but choosing who gets to run to be the president. Okay, let's talk about roles of the president. Turns out the president actually has a number of roles within the government. So we're going to talk about each of these individually. But the president serves as chief executive, the commander-in-chief, chief of state, chief diplomat, chief legislator, and his political party leader. So the first one, chief executive. The president serves as the head of the executive branch of government, the only branch of government that's headed up by a single individual. You look at the legislative branch, it's headed up by Congress. You look at the judicial branch, it's headed up by the Supreme Court. The executive branch is the only branch that's headed up by a single individual. Now, it's the job of the president and the job of the executive branch as a whole to make sure that the laws are executed, that is, that the laws are carried out. That is probably his number one job as a government official, to make sure that the laws are carried out. The president also serves as the commander-in-chief, and it's important to note that this is a civilian position. The President of the United States does not hold military rank. He's not a member of the armed forces. Now, he could have been in the past, and many of our presidents have served in the armed forces, but it's not a requirement and it's not part of the job. You are not a general, you're not an admiral, uh, you are not a ranking member of the armed forces. You are a civilian commander. Now, all that being said, the Constitution also says that Congress is the only body that can declare war, and Congress is the only body that can raise an army. And so powers over the military are split between the president and Congress. Although, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the chapter as well, as commander in chief, the president can and very often does send forces into combat. So even though Congress is the only body that can declare war, the president can send armed forces into combat, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The president also serves as the chief of state. This is the ceremonial head of the government that represents the country to the rest of the world. So, for example, I have a picture here of President Obama throwing out the first pitch of the World Series. That is a ceremonial and symbolic function that the president usually does. I actually went to update this picture and I was looking for a picture of President Trump throwing out the first pitch, and I don't think he's done it yet. So this was the latest picture I could find. But also, for example, like when foreign dignitaries come to the United States, they are received by the president. Other countries handle it differently sometimes. So, for example, England, you have both the Queen of England, who has very few powers in the government, but she is the symbolic chief of state. And then you have the actual political head of government, their prime minister. And so other places in the world have these duties split up. One person is the chief of state, the symbolic head of government, and then another person is the actual day-to-day running of the government type of individual. We don't. Ours is all rolled into the president. The president also serves as the chief diplomat. This is the role of the president when he interacts with foreign governments. And if you read the Constitution, we'll talk about this later as well. If you read the Constitution, most of the president's constitutional powers actually come in foreign policy. Presidents can make treaties, they can appoint ambassadors, they recognize foreign governments as legitimate, and they can make executive agreements. So they actually have quite a few powers in foreign policy. Probably realistically, the president has more power in foreign policy than he does in domestic policy. Presidents are also responsible for presidential doctrines, which are broad outlines of goals for American policy. So, for example, if you take a U.S. history course, you'll probably hear about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was the idea that Europe should stay out of New World affairs, that is the Americas, and the Americas would stay out of European affairs. Well, that was a presidential doctrine. For example, one more recently was the Bush Doctrine, the idea that America would fight global terrorism anywhere it occurred. That was a presidential doctrine, outline of goals for American policy. The president is also the chief legislator. Now, this is an important distinction. The president is not a member of Congress, which again is different than, say, a place like England. England operates under a parliamentary system in which the chief executive is part of the legislative body. In the United States, it's separate and distinct. You have Congress, which makes the laws, and then the president, which enforces the laws. The president is not a member of Congress. Now, the Constitution does say that the president must address Congress. That's what we today call the State of the Union. In reality, the president is a major force in Congress. He is a major force in shaping congressional agendas. He suggests new bills. He suggests the budget. He can veto bills. He can call Congress into session. So today, the president is a major player, even though that's not necessarily spelled out in the Constitution. And then last, but certainly not least, the president is his political party leader. Even though he may not be the longest serving member of his political party, he is seen as the symbolic head of the political party. So, for example, today, President Trump, member of the Republican Party, he is seen as the head of the Republican Party, which I think is a little odd sometimes for members of the Republican Party because he wasn't a long serving member of his party. He didn't serve as a senator, he didn't serve as a Republican governor before he ran for president. He didn't have a whole lot of interaction with the Republican Party before he became president. But since he is president, he is the head. And as president, he can control patronage. That means that he's in charge of giving government jobs to members of his political party, also known as the spoils system, as in to the victor go the spoils. He's in charge of rewarding party members with positions of power and influence. And so the president pushes the party agenda. They raise money for the party. They go out and make speeches for candidates. That's known as stumping. As we move into an election year next year, you will see President Trump will be flying all over the country making speeches and having appearances with Republican candidates in an effort to get them elected. Okay, let's talk about some of the constitutional powers of the president. Now, I know we've already spoken about this several times, but when the Constitution was being drafted, the issue of how much power to give the president was very hotly debated, with good reason. We had just come out of a system that had a very powerful executive in the King of England. We had tried a system that had a non-existent executive in the Articles of Confederation. So we had gone to two extremes and neither had worked. And so as we geared up to write the Constitution, how much power to give the executive, and in fact whether they should be an executive at all, was a subject of much debate. And so let's look at some of the constitutional powers of the President of the United States. First up, the President has the exclusive power to make treaties. A treaty is a formal agreement between two sovereign states. It's a permanent agreement between two countries. So an agreement between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico, or the United States, Canada, Mexico, Great Britain, Spain, France, whoever. A treaty is a formal agreement between two countries. Now, the president is the only one that can sign treaties. He's the only one that can negotiate. He can send power to someone to negotiate on his behalf, but he is the only one that can negotiate and sign treaties. The flip side of that is that the Senate must ratify these treaties, and this is not a rubber stamp process. There have been times where the president goes through all the negotiations, they come out with a treaty they're happy with, they sign on the dotted line, but if the Senate does not agree to it, that treaty never takes power and it's never enforced. A good example of this would be the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international organization created after World War I, which was designed to prevent future conflict. And of course, it didn't work. We had World War II. But one of the reasons it didn't work is because the United States never signed on to it. It was our idea. President Woodrow Wilson traveled to Europe to negotiate the end of World War I, and one of his ideas was to create the League of Nations. It was his idea, and we never joined because the Senate never ratified it. Another good example of this was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was a trade agreement that was signed, I believe, in 2016 by President Obama. However, when President Trump came into office, he didn't like it. He directed the Senate not to ratify it, and so it never took force. It never became legal because the Senate has to vote and agree to it. So that's one power of the president, to make treaties. Another power is to appoint ambassadors. Ambassadors are, the envoys of the United States to foreign countries. So you have an ambassador to France, and an ambassador to Spain, and an ambassador to Italy, and so forth and so on down the line. Now, again, those ambassadors have to be ratified by the Senate. He also has the power to pardon. The president can pardon any federal offense except impeachment. Now, a couple of things I want to point out about this. Power to pardon any federal offense. So if you are accused of breaking a state law, the president cannot help you. So let's say, for example, you commit murder or you're charged with committing murder. Murder is a state law and murder is a federal law. And so you could be charged in a state court or you could be charged in a federal court. If you're charged in a federal court, the president has the power to pardon you. If you are charged with a state law, the president cannot do anything. The governor, as the chief executive of the state, can pardon you, but the president cannot. So the president can pardon, he can't pardon anything, any federal offense except for impeachment. So if you are removed from office, the president can't do anything about that. Presidents also have the power to veto. Now, as part of the system of checks and balances, a presidential veto can be overridden with a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate. But they do have the power to strike down bills that have made it through Congress. Now, the way that presidential vetoes work, they have to either sign the entire bill or they have to veto the entire bill. They can't say, I like this part of the bill, I'm going to keep it, but this other part of the bill I don't like, I'm going to throw that away. That's known as a line item veto. A line item veto is when the president can go through line by line and mark out the items he doesn't like. It's all or nothing with a presidential veto. Presidents also have inherent powers. This is kind of similar to what we spoke about with Congress. The Constitution outlines certain powers, or certain obligations that Congress has, and it's understood that Congress has the power to carry out those obligations. Same thing with the president. The president has what's known as inherent powers, powers necessary to carry out his duties as outlined in the Constitution. These are very vague. And in general, presidents define the limits of power for himself, which is basically whatever he can get away with. Whatever the judicial branch will allow him to do, whatever the legislative branch will allow him to do, that is what a president will take for himself. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Now, there are some non-constitutional powers, powers that aren't listed in the Constitution or that don't have anything to do with the Constitution, such as delegated powers. These are powers that have been ceded to the president by Congress. Maybe at one point in time, it was a congressional power, but through the years, that power has been transferred from Congress over to the president. A good example of this might be the budgeting powers. So the budget is a bill passed by Congress, but most of the budget comes from the president. The president plays a very large role in today's budgeting process. Oh, well, that's the next line. And then also executive orders. Executive orders are, well, we'll talk about them in a little bit. So we'll save that. Let's talk about the expansion of presidential power, because one of the things that has happened over the years is that presidents have grown in power. It seems like every president adds a little bit of power to the powers he already had. And so by the time now we've got 40 some odd presidents, the office looks very, very different with President Trump than it did under, say, George Washington. So something that I think might be helpful is to talk about these two theories of presidential power. The first theory is known as the Whig theory. The Whigs are a political party in, well, they were originally a political party in England. They later also become a political party in the United States. But both in England and in the United States, the Whigs were a political party devoted to the idea of limiting executive power. And so the Whig theory of presidential power says that the president is limited to those powers expressly granted by the Constitution. So a Whig theorist would say the president can only do what the Constitution says he can do. And if you read the Constitution, it says the president has the power to do one, two, three, four, five, however. A Whig person would say presidents can only do those powers expressly listed in the Constitution. The flip side of that is known as the stewardship theory, which grants the presidents much more power because it says president have all the powers. It's a president whose powers are defined only by what he cannot do. So instead of saying you can only do one, two, three, four, five, it says you can do everything except A, B, C, D, E. Stewardship theory is much more expansive. It's much broader than the Whig theory. So as you might expect, most presidents are a fan of the stewardship theory because it allows them more power. If you read Article 2 of the Constitution, presidential powers are pretty vague. And so again, it's basically left up to the president to define for himself and the other branches as to what they will allow a president to do. So we're going to go through 3 periods of expansion of presidential power, the first one being under George Washington. And since he was the first president, he is going to set many of these traditions that future presidents are going to follow. So for example, the power to remove officials from office. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president has the power to remove certain officials from office. But George Washington said, listen, the Constitution says I can appoint these officials to office, and if I can appoint these officials to office, it stands to reason I can take it back. So he was the first president to remove officials from office. He was also the first president to meet with the president's cabinet. The president's cabinet are the head of the major agencies of the government. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about the executive branch. But George Washington was the first president to meet with his cabinet. And he was the first president, maybe submitted is not the right word, he was the first president to suggest legislation to Congress. He's not a member of Congress, so he can't introduce bills to become laws, but he can suggest Congress. He can lobby Congress. All right, the next big expansion of power under the presidents came with Abraham Lincoln, who of course was president during the Civil War. It was a time of great crisis for the United States, and so people were willing to grant Lincoln a few more powers in order so that he could take care of this crisis. And so, for example, Lincoln suspended constitutional liberties, he spent unappropriated money, and he blockaded southern ports. None of these powers are given to the president in the Constitution, but he got away with it because it was a time of crisis. He needed to act decisively, and so people allowed him to get away with it. Maybe the biggest expansion of presidential power came during the Great Depression and World War II with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Great Depression and World War II were huge events in American history. These are huge crises. And the simple fact of it was that Americans needed a leader. They needed someone who could act decisively. And so, for example, as part of the Great Depression, we see the New Deal. All of these new government regulatory agencies that are designed to keep an eye on the stock market, designed to keep an eye on banks, designed to keep an eye on big business. All of these new regulatory agencies all report to the president. And so this is a huge expansion of presidential power. And this is really the first time in American history that the president becomes the individual that people look to in times of crisis. For a very long period of time, most Americans had no interaction with the federal government. Their state legislature, their state governor, their local town councils, These individuals were much more important in the day-to-day life of most people than Congress and the president because they didn't have much to do. There was no Social Security, there was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid. There wasn't much to speak of in terms of national defense. And so the president was someone you voted for every 4 years who lived in a White House, maybe hundreds of miles away. This is before TV. This is before movies and the internet. You might not even know what your president looked like. It wasn't until the 1930s with FDR that he became the person that Americans turn to in times of crisis. So today, if something happens, it's not what is my state government doing? What is my governor doing? What is Congress doing? It's what is the president going to do to fix this problem? So the role expectation of the president changed dramatically under FDR, and all of a sudden, he is the government and he is the one that everyone turns to. Okay. Other reasons for the growth of presidential power. A lot of it has to do with media coverage. As we mentioned earlier, the president is a single individual. There are 9 members of the Supreme Court, and traditionally they stay out of the press. They don't hold press conferences. They hold their meetings, they issue their decisions, and that's pretty much it. Congress are much more active in the press, but there's 535 members of Congress. That's a lot of people to keep up with. The president is one singular individual. And so, like I said, over time, the president has become the face of the American government. If the president calls a press conference, you better believe that everybody's going to show up. There's a whole lot of power in that. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the abdication of congressional powers. Over time, Congress has either willingly or unwillingly given up powers to the president, and now the president has those powers and Congress does not. Speaking of Congress, the president has a huge amount of influence over Congress. The power to persuade is huge. And again, he's not a member of Congress. He can't vote on bills. He can't submit new legislation. But the power to persuade is huge. The president also has a lot of power over the economy. When he writes the budget, he's the one that determines how much money goes where. There's a lot of power associated with that. Also, as I mentioned earlier, are executive orders. Executive orders are orders to carry out a policy or policies described in a law passed by Congress. They have the force of law, but they aren't laws. There are no committee meetings, there is no process. An executive order is something that the president writes out and it's done and it has the force of law. And so, as you might expect, presidents love executive orders because it allows them to do basically what they want to do without having to go through Congress. And they really don't like having to go through Congress. They don't really like having to do things by committee. Now, there are a couple of limitations with executive orders. So, for example, it's an order to carry out a policy or policies described in a law passed by Congress. So there has to be a law already on the books. And the way that the president justifies this, he says it's my job to make sure the laws are executed. So here's a law to make sure that it's carried out. I need you to do this. That's what an executive order is. So there already has to be a law on the books that he can tie this executive order to. He can't just do anything he wants to. He has to be able to tie it to an existing law. The other thing that limits executive orders, they have the force of law, but laws are permanent. Executive orders are only as good as long as the president is president. So whenever President Trump steps down, if he doesn't run for re-election or he's defeated for re-election or he's term limited after 2 terms, after President Trump steps down, his executive orders will no longer be valid. Now, the next president can issue those same orders to keep them in force, but they don't have to. They're not permanent. They're only as good as long as the president is in office. All right, let's talk about the president in foreign affairs. Very similar to executive orders are executive agreements. Executive agreements are binding international agreements made between the president and a foreign head of state. And that's the key part of it. They have the same effect as treaties. They're the same legal status as treaties, but treaties are between two countries. So, for example, Canada and the United States sign a treaty. Treaties are permanent until, Congress or the Canadian Parliament revokes it. Executive agreements are between people. Treaties are between countries. Executive agreements are between people. So, Canada and the United States sign a treaty. The Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States sign an executive agreement. And it's kind of like an executive order. An executive order has the same legal status as a law. An executive agreement has the same legal status as a treaty. It does not require Senate approval. So again, presidents like executive agreements because they don't have to go through all the floor debate and the vote. They don't have to go through all that. They want it to happen, and so it does. But just like executive orders, executive agreements are only binding while both heads are still in power because it's an agreement between people. And as soon as one of those people are no longer in power, that executive agreement is no longer binding. Now, they don't require Senate approval, but presidents must notify Congress within 60 days. He can't do it in secret and keep it a secret. He has to tell Congress what has happened. Okay, one major part of foreign policy is warfare. And as we mentioned earlier, as outlined in the Constitution, only Congress can declare war. However, if you go through all of American history and you count up the number of times that Congress has declared war, it's only done so 5 times. So if I remember correctly, that would be the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, World War I, and World War II. So Congress has not declared war since World War II. So that doesn't count things like Korea, Vietnam, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. These are all major conflicts that the United States have been involved in that have not been declared war. And the reason that we get into these things is because the president does have the power to send troops into battle. As commander in chief, he has the authority to order troops into battle. Now, Congress has tried to limit this power. And it happened during Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam, even today, is synonymous with controversy. Vietnam was a deeply unpopular war in the United States. We were involved in Vietnam for at least a decade. Many of our American troops were killed overseas. And after or as Vietnam was winding down, Congress decided that they needed to put limitations on the authority of the president or the power of the president to send troops into battle. So in 1973, Congress passed what was known as the War Powers Resolution, which says this: the president can still send troops into battle because that is his constitutional right, but he has to notify Congress within 48 hours of doing so. And troops can only be deployed for 60 days. And you can extend that another 30 days in some circumstances, but at the end of 60 days, they have to come home. And so the idea behind the War Powers Resolution is maybe there is a crisis, maybe there is a catastrophe, you have to act quickly, and so the president can order troops into battle, but it cannot be a prolonged engagement. It can't last for months or years. You have to bring them home relatively quickly. Now, that brings up the question, is the War Powers Resolution effective? And you look at George W. Bush. I mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were conflicts that went on for years and years and years and years and years, and we're still feeling the effects of today. Congress did not declare war. It was much longer than 60 days that troops were overseas. So how did George W. Bush get around that? Well, Congress gave him the authority. Congress passed a law basically saying, you do what you need to do in order to protect Americans overseas. And that's what led us into Iraq and Afghanistan. So there are still ways around it, and that was a good example of Congress giving up one of their powers. Congress voted to give George W. Bush that authority. The president also has power over nuclear weapons. They are the only ones that can launch nuclear weapons. It began with President Truman, and of course, President Truman is the only American president to have ever authorized nuclear weapons to be used. The two atomic bombs dropped on Japan. But ever since then, it's not the call of a general, it's not the call of Secretary of Defense, it's the call of the president as to whether or not to use nuclear weapons. So as you might have gathered as we have gone through this chapter, very often the president and Congress sort of butt heads. Because the president may want to do one thing, Congress may want to do another. The president may be of one political party, the Congress may be controlled by the other. And so sometimes presidents and their Congresses don't get along. Now there are some advantages to both sides. For example, the president can act more quickly in times of crisis. He doesn't have to do everything by committee. He doesn't have to put anything to a vote. He just decides what is needed to be done and he does it. It's easier for the president to influence public opinion because he is the singular face of the government, so it's easier for him to influence public opinion. And he can claim executive privilege. This is something that you might have heard in the news. It's something that is going around right now. Executive privilege is the idea that the president can withhold information or refuse to appear before Congress or the court system. Now, the reason they can claim executive privilege is because the president is privy to some confidential information, and so sometimes he can say, I can't divulge that information because it's too high up or it's too classified or it's critical to the running of the government, and so I can't tell you that, or I can't appear to answer those questions. And the thing about executive privilege is that it can be extended to some other executive officials. So, for example, in the impeachment inquiry that's going on with President Trump right now, some of the officials underneath him, he has extended executive privilege to, saying, you don't answer those questions, you don't have to, you can claim executive privilege. Okay, advantages that Congress have. They do have more of a permanency to their actions. They can pass laws that are permanent. They can pass treaties that are permanent. They can regulate commerce. They have the power of the purse strings. They are the ones who ultimately decide what money is going to be spent where. They have a limited constituency, and that's actually fairly important. A member of the House of Representatives only has to keep his district happy to be reelected. A senator only has to keep his state happy in order to get reelected. A president is elected by the entire country. And so senators and congressmen have a limited constituency, whereas the president has to keep in mind the entire country. That can be a pretty important thing to consider. And also different term lengths. A president is in power for at most 8 years. Under very special circumstances, they can be in power maybe 9 to 10 years. Congress doesn't have term lengths. They can serve for 10, 15, 20 years. All right, let's talk about the organization of the executive branch. First up is the president's cabinet. The president's cabinet is an advisory group to the president that is made up of the heads of the executive departments. If you look on page 354 in your book, you will see a list of the executive departments in the United States. These are the major agencies that handle the day-to-day running of the government. So the Department of Commerce, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Defense, Department of Labor, Department of the Interior, Department of Agriculture, Department of State, or the State Department, so forth and so on. And so the heads of those agencies are part of this advisory group. So the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Defense, so forth and so on. Now, the cabinet, if I'm not mistaken, is mandated by law. The president has to meet with his cabinet every so often. But different presidents treat their cabinets differently. Some of them rely very heavily on them. Others, it's just more of a symbolic thing, and they don't go to them for advice all that often. So they have to have a cabinet, if I'm remembering that correctly, they have to have a cabinet, but how much they actually use it is purely discretionary. You also have what are known as kitchen cabinets. Kitchen cabinets are informal groups of advisors to the president. And the reason it gets this name is because early on, these informal advisors would come by, they would meet with the president, they would have a meal in his kitchen. They were known as the kitchen cabinets. And so maybe they're old friends, maybe they're other government officials, maybe they're state level officials somewhere else. They're informal groups of advisors. All right. You also have the executive office of the president. These are the agencies that assist the president in their major duties. So, for example, the White House office. This is the personal office of the president. These are individuals like his secretaries and his speechwriters, his lower level staff like deputy assistants. It's run by the chief of staff. The chief of staff is the primary assistant to the president. And in many ways, the chief of staff is a very powerful individual. Um, I would go so far as to argue that some chiefs of staff have not just been an assistant, they've really been more of a co-president than anything else. So chiefs of staff are incredibly important positions. They also contain individuals like the press secretary, they contain individuals like communications directors, political advisors, all those sorts of individuals. You have the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. We've mentioned them before. This is the agency that assists the president in preparing the budget. So this is an incredibly influential agency. This is the agency that goes to all the other federal agencies and asks for their budget. Then they roll them all together, and out of that, they create the overall federal budget. Incredibly influential. We have the Council of Economic Advisors. This is a three-member council that advises the president on economic matters. You have the National Security Council. This helps the president manage defense and foreign policy. And so you will see individuals like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, those sorts of advisors. You also see, for example, like the office of the First Lady. Today, most First Ladies have some sort of legislative agenda. Let's see, with Laura Bush, she put a great deal of emphasis on reading. Michelle Obama placed a great deal of emphasis on childhood nutrition. Melania Trump, she unveiled hers not too terribly long ago. Her initiative was called Be Best, and I'm not actually sure on what it's aiming to do. Um, Maybe an anti-bullying. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But the office of the First Lady, she has her own assistants. She has her own secretaries. So that's also part of the uh, executive office of the president. All right, let's talk for a minute about the vice president. We haven't said much about the vice president this semester. The vice president is kind of an interesting position within the American government. I think vice presidents have become more important in the past 10, 15, maybe 20 years than they have in years past. For many years in the American government, the office of the vice president is kind of a black hole of American politics. It's something that is important, but as it turns out, if you read the Constitution, the vice president doesn't have a whole lot of duties, which seems kind of counterintuitive. To me, it would seem like you would want the best qualified individual to become president, and you would want the second best individual to become vice president. But that's really not the way it works. And so the vice presidency, very few vice presidents are ever chosen with the idea of we better have somebody good in case something happens to the president. Um, the vice presidents for many years in American politics was kind of this guy's really important. We don't want to give him any real power, but we can't ignore him. We got to do something with him. Let's make him a vice president. Because most vice presidents don't go on to do anything. Today, it's seen as kind of a stepping stone to the presidency. But for most of American history, vice presidents did nothing and then they sort of faded away into obscurity. So today, usually it's chosen to help balance out the president. So, for example, President Trump, his vice president, Mike Pence. Mike Pence was a longtime member of Congress. He had served in the Senate for Indiana for many years. And so President Trump, of course, came in not having a whole lot of political experience. He never served in Congress. He wasn't a state governor or anything like that. And so Mike Pence has a lot of political experience. Um, President Obama, Joe Biden. Joe Biden was chosen because President Obama, as a senator, didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. Joe Biden had a lot of foreign policy. So, most often, the vice president is chosen to help balance out the president. Maybe you have a president from a northern state, so you choose a vice president from a southern state, something like that. And like I mentioned, it's a pretty unique role. They don't have a whole lot of duties, but they're also first in line to become the president, which is actually was a bit of a controversy the first time it ever happened. William Henry Harrison was the first American president ever to die in office. And so the question actually became, did his vice president, a man by the name of John Tyler, did Tyler just take over his duties and become vice president acting as president? Or did Tyler actually become the president itself? The Constitution doesn't say. And there was actually a pretty big question. Is he just going to take over for the president and act as the president? Or did he actually become the president? Well, we know the answer to that now. The vice president actually becomes the president. If the president dies in office, the vice president becomes the president. He swears the oath, he becomes president. What happens if the president doesn't die in office, but he can't perform his duty? What happens if he has a stroke? Or what happens if he goes into a coma? Again, the Constitution didn't really take that into account. Now there is a process. If the president cannot perform his duties, let's say that he knows he's going to have surgery and he knows that he's going to be placed under anesthesia and he's going to be out of it and he cannot fulfill the duties as president. If that is the case, he can inform Congress in writing saying, I'm going to go under anesthesia, I'm going to be unconscious. The vice president will take over not as the president, but as acting president until I'm able to return. And that has happened a couple of times where presidents know they were going in for maybe a routine medical procedure. They were going to be put under anesthesia. That has happened in the past. That's not that big a deal. What happens if it's unexpected? What happens if the president can't communicate? Then it's up to the cabinet. The majority of the cabinet has to vote, has to declare it to Congress, and in that case, the vice president takes over. Now, what if there is some dispute? What if the cabinet has said, we don't feel that the president is capable of performing his duties, we want the vice president to take over, and the president says, no, I can't. Maybe he's not in a coma. Maybe he has, I don't know, suffered some sort of mental breakdown. And the cabinet has said, we don't think he's capable of fulfilling his duties. And the president says, yes, I can. Then it becomes a contest of wills. And they actually have to vote on it. So if there is a dispute over whether or not the president can resume his normal duties, Congress actually has to vote on who gets essentially to be president. That's kind of a scary idea. If there's a power struggle between the cabinet and the president and the vice president, it can get nasty quick. It's never happened, but the potential is there. Let's say that there is a vacancy in the vice presidency. Maybe a vice president dies in office, or maybe a vice president resigns. That's happened a couple of times in American history. If that happens, the president will then nominate a new vice president, has to be confirmed by both the House and the Senate. A good example of this was President Ford. President Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, had a political scandal and he was forced to resign. Well, there was a vacancy in the vice president, and so President Nixon nominated Gerald Ford to become his vice president, who was confirmed by both the House and Senate. And then, of course, Nixon resigned. And so Ford ended up becoming president. The only American president never voted into the office. He was never voted in as vice president, never voted in as president by the American people or by the Electoral College. Only time that's ever happened, uh, and hopefully the only time it will ever happen. Okay, so that is the end of chapter